My greedy uncle and his spoiled son kicked me out of my late father's multi-billion-dollar architectural and urban development empire, calling me an unstable, overambitious girl who was freeloading on their corporate payroll. They erased my name from the official blueprints, revoked my digital access to the master servers, stole 7 years of my complex structural software designs, and tried to sell my father's ultimate dream project, a revolutionary self-sustaining green skyscraper complex, to an international investment conglomerate for $700 million. But they made one fatal mistake in their rush to become global real estate tycoons. My name is Evelyn, and I didn't just draw the architectural models for that megastructure. I engineered the entire automated smart grid, structural stability software, and internal security architecture from scratch. At their grand investor gala tonight, I didn't just reveal that their multi-million-dollar blueprints were a total structural disaster. I activated my remote diagnostic override live on international news, locked down the entire automated building, and watched federal agents haul them away in handcuffs. For nearly 6 long, painful years following my father's unexpected death, I lived like an underpaid ghost inside the glass-walled basement of Vance Architectural and Engineering Holdings. My father, David Vance, was a legendary structural engineer who spent his entire life dreaming of building eco-friendly, energy-independent vertical cities. He was a visionary genius, but his biggest flaw was trusting his manipulative brother, Richard, to handle the financial and corporate affairs of the company. When my father passed away, Richard used loopholes in the board charter to take over as chief executive officer, immediately bringing in his lazy, arrogant son, Brandon, as the executive managing director of construction. Brandon was a guy who hadn't spent a single day on a real construction site, couldn't calculate basic load-bearing physics, but walked around in bespoke designer suits, driving imported sports cars and boasting on social media about his fake engineering brilliance. My name is Evelyn. I inherited my father's brilliant spatial mind, his mathematical precision, and his relentless dedication to real science. While Brandon spent his weekends throwing wild parties on private yachts, I was locked inside the isolated Level 3 digital rendering lab for 16 hours a day. I poured my soul, energy, and youth into finalizing my father's ultimate legacy, a microclimate-smart megastructure codenamed Aegis Tower. Aegis Tower was not just a fancy glass building. It was an engineering masterpiece. It was designed with an ultra-advanced automated kinetic framework that adjusted to wind load, managed its own solar energy distribution, and used zero-emission geothermal cooling. On the global commercial market, the intellectual property rights for such a revolutionary architectural framework were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But to me, it was never about the luxury or the money. Aegis Tower was the promise I made to my father on his dying day, that his life's vision would change the skyline of the world forever. My reward for 6 years of relentless structural calculations came on a freezing Monday afternoon in early October. Richard called me up to the executive penthouse suite for what he claimed was an emergency project review. When I stepped into the room, Richard was sitting behind my father's old desk, smoking a cigar. Sitting across from him was Brandon, tossing a gold lighter in his hands with a condescending smile. On the glass table sat a single document, an immediate termination notice coupled with an aggressive, lifelong non-disclosure agreement. Richard didn't even look me in the eye as he slid the paper across the table. He told me in a cold, matter-of-fact voice that my presence at Vance Holdings was no longer required. He claimed that because I was emotionally unpredictable and lacked corporate leadership skills, I had become a liability to the company's upcoming international merger. He announced that Brandon was stepping in as the sole chief architectural director and owner of the Aegis Tower project effective immediately. Brandon leaned back, smirking right at my face. He told me that his name had already been registered with the International Architectural Board as the primary creator of Aegis Tower. He bragged that a massive Middle Eastern investment fund, Al Mansour Global Real Estate, had already agreed to purchase the complete design rights and land development contracts for a massive $700 million. "You should be grateful, Evelyn," Brandon sneered, tapping his gold lighter against the glass table. "We gave you a nice little desk and a steady salary, while you played with your 3D models in the basement. But real business takes status and power. We're taking this company to the global stage, and frankly, a quiet, introverted girl who spends her life staring at structural stress equations just doesn't fit the luxury brand." When I refused to sign their fraudulent agreement and refused to give up my father's original blueprints, Richard's polite mask shattered completely. He pressed an intercom button, called in 2 heavy private security guards, and ordered them to throw me off the premises immediately. I watched in absolute silence as those guards marched me down the private elevator, dragged me out through the rear loading docks, and threw my personal leather bag, containing my father's original, hand-drawn physical schematics, straight into the muddy rainwater in the alleyway. The lead guard stood over me and warned me that if I ever set foot near any Vance Holdings property again, Richard would have me arrested for criminal trespassing and industrial espionage. I sat there on the cold, wet pavement, holding my father's soaked blueprints against my chest, watching the heavy metal security gates lock shut. They thought I was finished. They assumed that a quiet structural engineer who spent her entire life surrounded by architectural software, load calculations, and physical scale models would break down, cry, and vanish into poverty. But Richard and Brandon were slick salesmen. They understood stock speculation, media spin, and tax loopholes, but they understood absolutely nothing about advanced structural mechanics or digital infrastructure. They viewed architectural software like a simple PDF document. They foolishly believed that whoever held the master USB drive in their hand was the true owner of the engineering behind it. What those greedy frauds failed to realize was that during my long silent nights in that basement lab over the past 3 years, I had anticipated their betrayal. I had watched Richard secretly transfer millions of dollars from the company's pension funds into unregistered shell accounts in Switzerland. I knew that the moment Aegis Tower received full structural safety approval, they would attempt to erase my name, erase my father's memory, and walk away with the fortune. So when I coded the final smart grid operating system and kinetic structural management code into the master building servers 4 months prior, I didn't just program the energy distribution and automated wind dampeners. I embedded an invisible, encrypted safety protocol deep within the central microprocessor firmware, known in structural engineering as a strain switch. The strain switch was a masterpiece of digital and physical engineering. It was designed to keep the building's kinetic dampers, smart elevators, and environmental controls functioning smoothly only if the primary mainframe received a daily encrypted authorization handshake from my personal, decentralized server at home. If the mainframe missed that authorization key for more than 72 consecutive hours, the strain switch would trigger a safe, automated lockdown protocol. The kinetic wind dampers would freeze in their default positions, the smart glass would tint to full blackout mode, and the main elevators would park safely at ground level, throwing emergency structural instability warnings across every terminal in the building. And because Brandon lacked the basic mathematical knowledge to read raw structural telemetry data, he had no idea the strain switch even existed. He just walked into the model showroom, looked at the gorgeous 3D holographic rendering of the building, and assumed he was holding a golden ticket to $700 million. Exactly 72 hours after they threw me into the alleyway, the timer expired. That afternoon, Brandon was attempting to run an interactive structural simulation for a group of lead engineers and technical inspectors sent directly by Al Mansour Global Real Estate. Naturally, when he initialized the primary simulation core, the monitors didn't show a stable green building matrix. Instead, every display screen in the preview center turned dark amber, flashing critical structural load warnings and system failure codes. Panic set in fast. At 3:45 p.m. my private phone rang. It was an unlisted burner number. I answered calmly. On the other end of the line was Brandon. The arrogant, smug tone he had used in the penthouse 3 days ago was completely gone. His voice was trembling, cracking with pure panic. He screamed at me, accusing me of sabotaging the company's servers, demanding to know why the building's digital twin was locking up and throwing structural error codes. He threatened to call the police and have me thrown into a high-security prison for 20 years for digital sabotage. I sat quietly by the window of my small apartment, sipping hot coffee, looking out at the city skyline, and spoke in a cold, deadpan voice. "Brandon," I said softly, "if you are truly the visionary structural engineer and sole creator listed on that multi-million-dollar design patent, then clearing a basic kinetic dampener logic error should take you 2 minutes. Why are you begging a talentless basement girl for help?" Before he could scream another word, I hung up the phone and turned it off. I didn't just sit back and watch, though. Passive revenge is meaningless without legal justice, and I wanted total, absolute destruction. Over the past 72 hours, while Brandon was blindly celebrating his fake victory, I had been working around the clock with Agent Sarah Vance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, along with senior investigators from the National Intellectual Property Board. I presented them with irrefutable, ironclad evidence. My original time-stamped architectural files, raw CD mathematical logs dating back 6 years, digital signatures from my private server, and forensic financial records proving that Richard had illegally forged my father's corporate shares transfer while he was on his deathbed. Together, we carefully planned the ultimate trap, setting our target on the biggest night of the real estate industry. The Global Architecture and Development Summit held at the Grand Imperial Ballroom. The Grand Imperial Ballroom was an absolute display of corporate wealth and excess. Over 2,000 high-profile guests filled the room. Foreign investors, famous architects, government officials, commercial developers, and live international news crews with broadcast cameras lined up along the raised balconies. Richard and Brandon had spared no expense to make this night their personal crowning moment. In the center of the main stage, a massive 20-foot physical glass scale model of Aegis Tower glowed with brilliant internal LED lights, while giant 8K screens displayed dynamic renderings of the megastructure. Brandon was standing near the podium wearing a custom tuxedo, surrounded by news reporters, loudly telling fake stories about how he spent countless sleepless nights at his drafting table, designing the future of sustainable architecture. Richard was standing beside Sheikh Al-Mansour, the billionaire chairman of the investment group, holding a gold fountain pen over a leather-bound contract worth $700 million. "Tonight, ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced into the microphone, his voice echoing through the master sound system, "Vance Holdings ushers in a new era of human achievement. We are officially signing over the international construction and design rights of Aegis Tower to our partners." Sheikh Al-Mansour smiled, bringing the gold pen down toward the signature line. "I strongly suggest you do not sign that document, Sheikh Al-Mansour." A sharp, clear voice rang out across the ballroom. The sound carried through the venue speakers with such absolute clarity that the entire room went dead silent. The live band stopped playing. The news camera operators immediately rotated their lenses. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung wide open. I stepped into the room, walking steadily down the long red-carpeted center aisle. I was wearing a tailored midnight black suit, holding a sleek industrial diagnostic tablet. Walking directly behind me were 8 uniformed United States Marshals and 4 senior forensic agents from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Richard's face instantly changed from a proud, smiling red to a pale, ghostly white. He practically lunged for the microphone, screaming at the venue security team to drag me out, telling the crowd that I was an unstable, disgruntled former employee who had been fired for incompetence. "Security won't step a foot near me, Richard," I said, my voice completely steady as I reached the base of the stage and walked up the steps, standing right between Brandon and the billionaire investor. "Because I am executing a federal court order issued 2 hours ago by the United States District Court to conduct an immediate forensic audit of the intellectual property you are attempting to sell." Brandon broke into a cold, heavy sweat, his hands shaking so violently, he dropped his wine glass onto the stage floor, shattering it. He stammered that the contract was legal property, and that I had no right to interrupt their private business event. "If this structure is truly your engineering breakthrough, Brandon, and if the blueprints contain functional, safe mathematics," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "then you should have zero objections to a quick 5-second diagnostic scan of the project's master server link." Sheikh Al-Mansour pulled his gold pen back, his eyes narrowing as he looked back and forth between Richard's panicked face and my calm composure. "Hold the signature," the Sheikh commanded his legal team. "Let her run the scan." I didn't wait another second. I raised my tablet, pointed the wireless interface at the automated scale model on stage, and tapped the screen to trigger the final override signal. A deafening emergency alarm screeched through the ballroom audio system. The gorgeous 20-foot scale model of Aegis Tower on stage suddenly flickered violently, its internal green light switching to a flashing emergency red, before the motorized kinetic panels jammed and locked up. The massive 8K LED screens behind the podium immediately stopped showing Brandon's promotional videos. In their place, the screens began scrolling at lightning speed through thousands of pages of my original, time-stamped architectural logs, my father's handwritten structural stress equations, and full forensic banking statements displaying Richard's secret Swiss shell accounts in bright yellow highlights. And right in the center of the main display, in massive glowing bold red text, the system output read, "Structural calculations unverified. Kinetic grid locked by author. Fraudulent blueprints detected. Sole intellectual property of Evelyn Vance." A massive collective gasp exploded from the audience of 2,000 elites. Dozens of journalists rushed toward the stage, camera flashes exploding like a lightning storm, capturing every single second of the disaster on live television. "What is the meaning of this?" Sheikh El Mansour roared, slamming his fist onto the table. He turned to Richard, his face contorted in pure rage. "You absolute criminal frauds. You tried to sell my investment group $700 million worth of stolen, dysfunctional designs." Brandon completely collapsed. His knees gave out and he dropped onto the hard stage floor, crying hysterically, grabbing his father's coat, blabbering incoherent excuses. Richard tried to back away slowly toward the backstage exit, attempting to slip into the shadow of the curtains. "Richard Vance. Brandon Vance." The lead United States Marshal boomed over the microphones. Four marshals stepped up onto the stage, cutting off every exit point. The lead officer pulled out a thick stack of federal arrest warrants, stepping directly in front of Richard. "Richard Vance, Brandon Vance," the marshal announced loudly for every live news camera to record. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, intellectual property theft, corporate embezzlement, and securities fraud." The officers grabbed Richard's arms, twisting them behind his back and snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Richard lost all his corporate dignity, screaming curses at me, trying to kick at the agents as they dragged him across the stage. Brandon was lifted off the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. His designer tuxedo rumpled and his face covered in tears as he was led past the very investors, media reporters, and architects he had spent months trying to deceive. I walked slowly over to the podium, picked up the physical scale model component, and looked down at Richard as the officers forced him toward the exit doors. "My father built this firm on truth, integrity, and safety to build a better future," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the entire silent hall. "You tried to build an empire on theft and deception, and you forgot the most basic rule of architecture. A structure built on a fake foundation will always collapse." The legal aftermath was swift, brutal, and absolute. With the federal warrants executed and my original mathematical CD files verified by the Supreme Court's IP tribunal, the courts immediately stripped Richard and Brandon of all corporate authority. The forged share transfers were completely annulled, and full unencumbered ownership of Vance Holdings, its real estate assets, engineering patents, and architectural facilities was legally awarded back to me as Dr. David Vance's true heir and the proven author of Aegis Tower. Within 2 weeks, I walked back into the main headquarters, not through the rear alleyway, but through the front lobby doors as the chief executive officer. I fired Richard's corrupt board members, dismantled the fake marketing executive teams, and reinstated every honest engineer and architect who had been pushed aside. I uploaded the authorization keys from my home server, clearing the strain switch and stabilizing the real Aegis Tower system once and for all. But instead of selling the exclusive rights to a private investment group for $700 million, I partnered directly with transparent, eco-friendly public housing initiatives and sustainable urban development funds, ensuring that my father's dream skyscraper would be built safely and benefit cities around the world. As for Richard and Brandon, their offshore bank accounts were completely frozen and seized by federal prosecutors to pay back millions of dollars in court fines and damages to defrauded investors. Today, they are serving a non-parole 12-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, spending their days doing hard manual labor, completely broken by the very greed that drove them to betray their own family. The fake engineers were deleted from history, the truth was fully restored, and my father's legacy was finally right where it belonged, in the hands of the daughter who built it from the ground up. My toxic relatives thought they could throw me out into the rain, erase my father's memory, and sell my intellect for a quick fortune, but they learned the ultimate unchangeable engineering law. An empire built on fraud will always crumble when the true structural weight is applied. Today, Richard and Brandon are staring at 4 concrete walls inside a federal prison. Vance Holdings is leading a global green architecture revolution, An Aegis Tower is being built to change skylines forever. But the battle to protect real innovation is far from over. Next week, a rival corrupt real estate tycoon attempts to sabotage our primary construction site by hiring an undercover operative to swap our high-grade materials with defective concrete and frame my company for a collapse. If you want to see how Evelyn uses her high-tech site monitoring network to trap the saboteur in the act and expose the rival tycoon on national television, make sure to smash that subscribe button right now, leave a like, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on Evelyn's ultimate payback. See you in the next story.